Hello and welcome to this recording from Support Cambridgeshire. This training introduces the key legal issues around managing volunteers. There are guidance links available in the transcript which you will find alongside this recording. These links will provide you with all the materials we mention. Please note that this guidance is not intended to replace advice from a legal professional. This session will give you headline information to put in place the policies and procedures to help you deliver your legal responsibilities to volunteers and those they support. We will look at employment rights, who can legally volunteer, and key legislation covering equality, health and safety, data protection, copyright, and safeguarding. There is no legal definition of a volunteer, but the following is used by the Disclosure and Barring Service. A person engaged in an activity which involves spending time, unpaid, except for travel and other approved out-of-pocket expenses, doing something which aims to benefit some third party other than or in addition to a close relative. Trustees are responsible for the governing of a charity and usually have more responsibility and liability than non-trustee volunteers. We have a specific training available for trustees, What Do Trustees Have to Do, which can be found in the guidance links. Failure to understand how legislation relates to volunteers could result in organisations facing legal action, with volunteers claiming employment rights, around failure to protect volunteers, and around failure to provide training and support to ensure volunteers are able to perform their roles without causing harm to beneficiaries or the wider public. An organisation's lack of legal understanding can also result in negative consequences for volunteers themselves, impacting on their finances and well-being. Volunteers do not have the same legal rights as people with employment contracts, unless a contract is inadvertently created. It's worth being aware of what creates a contract. A contract is a legally binding relationship between two parties. It needs four elements to be legally binding: an offer, which is a promise by one side with the intention of creating a legal obligation; an acceptance, the response to the offer, which can be written or verbal; consideration, and this can be a payment or something in kind such as equipment or training not directly related to the volunteer's role; an intention by both parties to create a legally binding relationship that a reasonable person would accept as intending to create a contract. By contrast, volunteering is a gift relationship and is not legally binding on either party. There have been cases where volunteers have been able to take an organisation to an employment tribunal and prove that a contract exists. For more details, see the guidance links. If a contract is created with a volunteer, they could be awarded employee status, which in the worst case scenario could make them eligible for the national minimum wage backdated for the entire period of their volunteering. This is likely to have serious consequences for a charity. The danger of creating a case for employed status is minimised by ensuring there is no legally binding contract in place and that there are clear policies and procedures specifically for volunteers that avoid using language associated with employment. For example, volunteers perform a role and not a job and are reimbursed for expenses and not paid. Good records need to be kept of training undertaken and expense payments received. The organisation might consider putting in place a volunteer strategy and a volunteer policy, which will clarify how the organisation interacts with volunteers, clearly demonstrating how volunteering differs from the work of any employees. Volunteer role descriptions clarify the purpose, qualities and requirements of a role, helping distinguish them from employee job descriptions. Volunteer agreements are statements of mutual expectation that can be ended at any time by either party and are not legally binding. Mismanagement of expenses can cause problems for your volunteers, and you could be seen to be paying a consideration, which is one element of a contract. The Inland Revenue rules permit volunteers to reclaim costs incurred or which will be incurred whilst volunteering, including mileage, a reasonable meal, specialist clothing and care costs for dependents. However, although it is best practice to offer expenses, organisations are not legally obliged to pay them. Payments made to volunteers that are more than out-of-pocket expenses may be treated as taxable income. If the volunteer is in receipt of benefits, any overpayment may impact on benefit payments, as they will be treated as if they were in paid work. By collecting and keeping the right documentation, as outlined in an expenses policy, you protect both the organisation and the volunteer. See the link in the guidance notes on volunteering and claiming benefit payments. We often get asked questions about whether the law allows certain groups of people to volunteer. The good news is that most people are legally able to volunteer. The exceptions being those whose visa status excludes them and those who do not meet the required criminal or safeguarding checks for a particular role. We will look at these later in this recording. People on benefits can volunteer as long as they continue to meet all the conditions of their benefit, and it is advisable that they inform the benefits office that they are volunteering. The legal restrictions on employing young people do not apply to volunteers. However, under 18s are legally classed as vulnerable and safeguarding guidelines will apply. It's also necessary to check if under 18s are covered by your insurance, and you should put in place a separate risk assessment. There is a guidance link for a handbook on managing young volunteers at the end of this transcript. Visitors from overseas can volunteer if their visa allows them, and it is advisable to ask them to check with the Immigration Service. Those on tourist visas can volunteer, as can refugees and asylum seekers. Some larger organisations insist on right-to-work checks for volunteers. This check is to ensure a job applicant is eligible to work in the UK and is only legally required for employees. People with criminal convictions are legally permitted to volunteer, and where a person has completed their rehabilitation, they do not have to disclose a conviction unless the role meets certain exemption requirements. Exemptions will usually apply to roles with access to children or adults at risk of abuse. In this section, we will work through the key legislation those managing volunteers need to consider. We will highlight key areas to be aware of and look at how to mitigate the risk of facing legal action, starting with equality legislation. The Equality Act protects people against discrimination, harassment or victimisation because they have or are perceived to have or are associated with someone else with any of the protected characteristics, which are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy, maternity and paternity, race, religion and belief, sex and sexual orientation. Volunteers do not have the same legal protection as employees, however service users are protected. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has advised that volunteers could, in some circumstances, be seen as service users, creating the potential for a legal case to be brought. Many organisations address this head-on by adding a clause, like the following on the slide, to their volunteer equality statement. If your organisation provides advice in person or online, a community centre, shop, club, care home or a private club or association with more than 25 members, then the Equality Act applies to your service. Where volunteers help you deliver your services, they are seen as your service deliverers carrying out your instructions. If in their planning or delivery of these instructions, the volunteer does something defined as unlawful, discriminatory, harassment or victimisation, you can be held legally responsible for what they've done. To minimise the risk, put in place an equality, diversity and inclusion policy and procedure for volunteers to follow. Offer training and ongoing support to ensure volunteers understand how to behave and carry out their tasks keeping within the law. Check out the guidance links for more on this. Volunteers are not protected by all the same health and safety legislation as protects employees. However, an organisation has a duty of care to anyone they encounter to ensure they do not cause any unreasonable harm. As service deliverers, volunteers need to be trained and supported to ensure public safety. It is best practice to put in place a health and safety policy and procedures for volunteers to follow. This will include putting in place risk assessments for activities and venues. Although there is generally no legal obligation to insure volunteers, the Charity Commission strongly advise that volunteers are covered by the same level of insurance as employees. We have an on-demand training available on both health and safety and insurance. See the guidance links. The regulator for all organisations managing data is the Information Commissioner's Office, which produces a wealth of guidance. Most volunteer involving organisations hold information on their volunteers. This information is likely to be personal data that identifies an individual, and may also include sensitive data, which is confidential data, such as an individual's medical record, which must be kept particularly secure. Volunteers' data is protected, and volunteers can view their own records through subject access requests, including access to references given by third parties. As service deliverers, volunteers must comply with data protection legislation. There is no volunteer exemption, and any organisation that asks volunteers to process data must manage the risks adequately. The NCVO Data Protection and Volunteers Guidance in the guidance links explains the legal requirements for handling data, the data protection principles, and the reasons, i.e. the lawful basis you must establish for processing data. Please note that in most cases, not-for-profit organisations managing their own data do not have to register with the Data Protection Regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office. To minimise risk, put in place a data protection policy and procedure for volunteers to follow. Ensure you have in place a privacy statement that can be shown to anyone whose data is being collected. In the guidance links, there is a Create Your Own Privacy Statement tool. Ask volunteers to complete an information consent form for their own data, see guidance links. Ask volunteers to sign an agreement covering data protection and confidentiality. Offer training and ongoing support to ensure volunteers understand how to carry out their tasks within the law. When an employee creates something as part of their contract of employment, whether it's a blog, photo or illustration, the material belongs to the employer. This is not the case for volunteers who retain the copyright for whatever they create. This can be challenging when a volunteer decides to withdraw their permission for something the organisation has invested in. For example, a logo or a photograph used in a printed leaflet or on a display board. A volunteer can be asked to complete a deed of assignment to transfer copyright to the organisation. An example is shown in the guidance links. An alternative is to agree a licence, where the volunteer retains ownership but allows use of the material. This is usually in return for a payment. If a licence is agreed, legal advice should be sought to avoid complications over whether any payment could contribute to the creation of an employment contract. Charities have a responsibility to keep everyone who is in contact with the organisation safe, including online. You must minimise the risks of any harm or abuse, ensure everyone has confidence their concerns will be dealt with appropriately, ensure everyone in the charity understands their role. People working with children are expected to report concerns about a child's welfare to the relevant agencies. Organisations that work with children and families must have safeguarding policies and procedures in place. A summary of all the key legislation is available from Writing Safeguarding Policies and Procedures, NSPCC Learning. The CARE Act 2014 applies to any person 18+ who has needs for care and support, is experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, is unable to protect themselves from the risk of experience of abuse or neglect. Only those that meet the adult at risk criteria should be referred to adult safeguarding. The Disclosure and Barring Service, or DBS, maintains a record of a person's criminal convictions and cautions and decides who should be barred from working with vulnerable groups and put on the barred list. The DBS maintains 4 different levels of check. These, together with more detail on the definitions of regulated activity, are explained in the Safeguarding for Volunteer Managers guidance link. Before an organisation considers asking a volunteer to assist them in making an application for a DBS check, they are legally responsible for ensuring that they are entitled to submit a check for the role. Not all roles are eligible for DBS checks. There is a link to an eligibility tool shown in the guidance links. DBS checks can only be carried out for successful applicants who are appointed to a role, so when you make an offer to a volunteer, you should clearly state if this is subject to a satisfactory DBS check. You should be aware that under the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, people do not have to disclose spent convictions in an application form unless the role is exempt from the Act. Regulated activity is a legal phrase used to describe specific circumstances where individuals are working or volunteering with children or vulnerable adults because of help or treatment they are receiving. A definition of regulated activity is shown in the guidance links. Anyone volunteering in regulated activity will be required to have an enhanced DBS with barred list check. The barred list is a database that contains the details of individuals who have been banned from working with children or vulnerable adults due to past behaviour or offences. It is illegal to knowingly allow a person on the barred list to work or volunteer in regulated activity. Anyone who supervises staff or volunteers who carry out regulated activities will also need the same level of check. Unless an organisation is requesting large numbers of DBS checks, they will be required to use an umbrella body to submit their DBS forms. The DBS does not charge for volunteer DBS checks, but the umbrella body will charge an administration fee. The DBS Update Service is a subscription service that is free for volunteers. The Update Service keeps the certificate up to date, adding any new convictions, and can be shared with other volunteering organisations if the volunteers wish to share it. Volunteers must choose to register for the update service themselves within 30 days of their certificate being issued. DBS checks can only be done for people aged over 16. Any DBS certificate information is confidential. It should be kept securely and only seen by those who need to see it as part of their duties. DBS checks for refugees and asylum seekers require a particular approach involving fingerprinting. DBS checks are not usually suitable for people other than refugees and asylum seekers who have recently lived outside the UK, but it might be possible to obtain a similar check from the country where the individual was last resident. See guidance links for getting a criminal record check from outside the UK. Organisations need to put in place a culture of safeguarding. DBS checks will only show up concerns for people who have been convicted of offences or placed on the barred list, and not all roles are eligible for these checks. Therefore, the way your organisation recruits, inducts, trains and supervises volunteers, encouraging people to be honest and share any concerns is key. For more on developing a culture of safeguarding, see the guidance links in the transcript. Offer training and ongoing support to ensure volunteers understand how to behave and carry out their tasks within the law. See the guidance links below for training you can share with volunteers. Put in place a policy and procedure for volunteers to follow. There is a safeguarding policy guidance shown in the guidance links, which takes you through what a child and adult safeguarding policy and procedure should cover. For more help, check out the guidance links in this recording's transcript, and you can contact our team at info@supportcambridgeshire.org.uk.